Hello.
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 To make sure this mic is not going to suddenly drop. Welcome. Thanks to everyone for coming out. It is always really, really heartening to see a completely full house here. So thank you for filling all this space. Welcome to Passages Bookshop. Some of you, I'm sure, have not been here before. I've been in this building for about 3 years, and the building is 1895, which for Portland is pretty old. It's had artists in the building for 40 years. We have one of the artists here, Trudy Parkinson, who was an artist on the second floor. And it's really great to be in this building and part of that community, so I'm very thankful for that. A few housekeeping announcements before we begin. If you have a cell phone or a satellite device or anything else that you need to silence, now's a good time to do it. There is a bathroom on the far wall, that's the far east wall past the elevator. I want to tell you about another reading that's coming up. I also want to tell you that if you would like to hear about other events that are happening at Passages Bookshop, readings, music, lectures, things of that sort, there's a mailing list, email mailing list on my desk, and you can give me your email address and you'll get occasional announcements about events happening here and sometimes other events in town, like this summer there'll be a book fair that I'll be one of the exhibitors at. And there are also on my desk copies of books by both Roger and Marc. I hope that you will take a chance to look at those and perhaps buy copies after the event. I'm sure they'll be happy to sign copies. And in 2 weeks, on Saturday the 24th, the next reading in the Spare Room Reading Series will take place. Spare Room Reading Series is in its 24th year. And yeah, we've had almost 300 readings in that time. And we will have a poet and translator from Minnesota, David Hodbonic, whose terrific contemporary translation of the Aeneid was published not long ago. Rodney Konicki, a local writer, and Marilyn Stabline, who is here, who has published a number of books about her time in India and Nepal, including her most recent book, Tantric Songlines, which I think may interest some of you, and there are copies here on that table. And Marilyn will be reading with Rodney and David Hodbonic. And you know why we're here today. This is a co-production of the Portland Shambhala Meditation Center and Passages Bookshop. Ben reached out to me from Shambhala, and I'm going to let him introduce the readers and tell you about Portland Shambhala. Hope you enjoy, and thanks for being here.
All right, thanks so much, David. One more round of applause for David for letting us help. Yeah, what an honor. I feel like so starstruck and underqualified to be in front of all of you, and also just super happy that you can just send emails to inspiring people in 2025 and they'll want to do stuff together. So this all came about because on Shambhala Day this year, we were hanging out at John's house, and a member said, oh, this guy Roger Jackson is going to be in town with Maitripa College, and he's so cool, you should see if he wants to do something with our book club. He wrote a review of the book we're reading in our book club. So I just reached out to Roger, and then in tracking down his email address, just stalking him online, I found that he was researching Buddhism and the Beats. And of course, Shambhala and the Beats have this incredible joint lineage. And so I thought, oh, we could really do something together that would be in line with the Shambhala tradition, as well as in line with, maybe encouraging Roger to get his ducks in a row and prepare to talk about his scholarship. So then Robert Lovett, another Portland Shambhalian, said, oh, if you guys are doing Buddhism and the Beats, you should get Marc involved, because Marc is a Portland poet and super involved with the Beats, and made short films with them and wrote books about them, and is a tremendous poet in his own right. And so why not, have a lineage holder of the beat tradition be at the Buddhism and the Beats thing. So yeah, I thought
an actual
cool.
beat.
Yeah, so now we're here. We did, in true like punk rock, Shambhala beat tradition, we're all really high on LSD right now. And so, everyone's melting. We were just trying to really get that Boulder 1974 energy in here. So we are a mile high and cruising. No, that's a joke. My family is here. Yeah, so I guess I just wanted to introduce Portland Shambhala Meditation Center is still thriving. We are we're midway between surviving and thriving because we had to move out of our center because it's expensive to rent and operate a religious center in Portland in 2025. However, we have a lot of online offerings, and then we also have in-person offerings like this event. We have on July 22nd, we're going to have an amazing author who's visiting town and doing a reading from her book about aging. And I'm totally blanking on her name, David.
Sharon Lookert.
Yeah, that's right, Sharon Lookert. And she just published a book.
Losing your mind about dementia.
Yeah, it's about dementia and losing your mind.
Very relevant.
Is it a Shambhala publication?
Yes.
Yeah, it's a Shambhala publication, so also the people that publish Roger. So we're putting that together, and we're going to be doing meditations in Laurelhurst Park. We have regular Zoom meetings. We're right now attending the Shambhala online group that Galen Ferguson is leading about Mother of the Buddhas. It's a Heart Sutra, kind of deep dive into the Heart Sutra, and then after the online workshop, we're meeting in person and discussing what we're learning and kind of expanding on our learning in different houses of local Portland Shambhala people. So I put a little email list sign up back there. We're also on Facebook, which is very popular and cool. We're also on Instagram, which is also very popular and cool and run by really great people who have your best interests at heart. So if God forbid you're using those devilish apps, please follow us and like and share and comment on our things so that more people know about what we're doing. I think it's really great that I guess we have a bunch of Maitripa homies here. We have a bunch of Passages Bookshop homies here. We have a bunch of Portland Shambhala homies here. So it's so cool that all of you came together for this event. Roger is an eminent scholar. He is in town talking about his Saraha book, which he has copies of to publish. Saraha, amazing poet who has been canonized and made major contributions to Buddhist scripture and theology. And yeah, super excited to hear what he has to say. I think I'll stop talking. Yeah, I kind of introduced you guys, right? So we're gonna do some meditating. Each of these guys will do some talking solo, and then we'll have a panel discussion, which hopefully will just be you guys asking them questions. I have like 3 questions, and I will surely generate more, but if you wanna be pondering things you wanna ask these dudes who have a wealth of information, please come up with some questions while you're listening. And thanks for being here.
Working?
Yeah.
Audible? Good. So each of us is going to start off with some version of a little meditation before we get up onto our spiels, which will come shortly. And for the one I'm going to do is lifted, not verbatim, but at least in spirit, from Jack Kerouac's The Dharma Bums. So I would ask you to sit comfortably in your chair with a straight back, and ideally for this one, I think close your eyes and visualize in the space before you first a person you consider beloved. It could be a wife, a child, a parent, anybody who just warms your heart when you see them. And try to visualize that person clearly, and visualize them to your right. Then to your left, visualize someone who troubles you. Maybe not the word enemy necessarily, but someone who when you see this person, or even if you think about this person, you feel perturbed. And try to picture this person too. And then in between them, visualize not a complete stranger, but somebody you know but know almost nothing about, someone who generates, say, neutral feelings in you. And try to visualize them clearly enough that you can see their eyes. It's very important to be able to see their eyes in this meditation. So just take a moment and move from one to the other and simply experience the feelings that arise as you consider each of these three persons. And now, turn to the first, to the right in the space before you, to the beloved one, the friend, the lover, whomever it might be, and think to yourself, such and such a person, equally empty, equally to be loved, equally a coming Buddha. And turn then in the middle to the near stranger, the person you know very little. Look them in the eye, think to yourself, imagine yourself even saying to them, such and such a person, equally empty, equally to be loved, equally a coming Buddha. And turn at last then out to the left to the person who perturbs you and say to this person, looking them right in the eye, such and such a person, equally empty, equally to be loved, equally a coming Buddha. And reflect then that these three persons you've selected stand in for all sentient beings, and recognize that all sentient beings throughout the cosmos, wherever they may be, are just like these three, equally empty, equally to be loved, equally coming Buddhas. Okay, thank you.
Okay, I don't think I need a mic, so I'm just going to read a short description of the origin of what we're going to do next. I figure most of you know how to meditate, and so we're just going to pretend that you don't, and we won't single out those who are not meditators. You're safe. So at any rate, I wanted to read this short piece in description of what we're going to do. Gordon Ball quotes Ginsberg's personal shift in 1972. My guru, Tibetan Lama Chogyam Trungpa, suggested I try a different one. A different one, which is appreciation of the spaciousness around us. Chanting Om so aggressively didn't intrigue people to enter that space, but probably just mystified them. Ginsberg said in his lecture, What the East Means to Me, given at Kyoto Saika University in 1988, that Trungpa also added about his mantra chanting, you can get them high, but you cannot ground it in any practice. Also, again, from Allen's Vomit of the Mad Tiger, ah was just a good old American 4th of July sound. Like, ah, fireworks. The Tibetan ah literally represents primordial openness. In 1974, Ginsberg would be including ah and Trungpa's meditation instruction as part of his own public performances. So we're going to duplicate that. This is a Shruti box. It's not a harmonium. Don't want to mislead you. I'm going to get the sound pulsing, and then if you will join me with the sound ah, and then we'll sit briefly. So there we go. Ah. again with straight spine. Eyes open this time. You can blink. And just follow your breath going in and out of your nose. Eyes gazing down. And now especially pay attention to the out-breath dissolving into space. And as Padmasambhava said, the founder of Buddhism, don't retrace the past, don't anticipate the future, remain in the present, leave your mind alone. So now we'll just sit for a short time. If you Shambhalans would join me in dedicating the merit, that's something that's generally done. But we have a specific way of doing it.
By this merit may all obtain omniscience, may it defeat the enemy wrongdoing, from the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may I free all beings.
Now my esteemed colleague.
So I'm going to break the spell. Somebody's got to do it. How do you follow up? Anyway, I'm delighted to be here on this occasion, and thanks to David and to Ben and various other folks for pulling this together. And it's been fun for me to get to know Mark, first on a long call, and then we had a long lunch last Saturday. So this is the fruit of all of that. This is probably the first talk I've given on this topic. I've been researching it for a very long time. I actually taught a course at Carleton College, where I was for 30 years, a Frosh seminar called Buddhism and the Beats in 2010. And of course, I'd been interested in the beats, for many, many years before that. But that's what sort of turned me towards thinking, well, maybe when I finish all this translation stuff, I'll just do something on the beats. And it's kind of taken on a life of its own. I confess that I have not written a single word of the book yet, but the research is mostly done. I've got an outline, and if I live so long, perhaps there'll be something down the road a little ways. But what I want to, the reason for writing a book on it, I mean, many people would say, come on, why would you do that? In fact, I think it's sort of a de rigueur disclaimer that almost all scholars of the beats have to issue at the beginning of their books their scholarly books on them. It's like, we can't capture this. It really, the beats were anti-scholastic, but we're going to do this anyway. So I'm probably in that kind of lineage of disclaimer and apology, because it will be a more academically inclined book. And what I'm hoping to do in my book is take an angle that I don't think has been taken before, which is to look at the Beats and their interest in Buddhism as part of the larger historical development of Buddhism, both in the world and specifically in the US, or we might say North America. So that's where I think maybe I have something to encourage, because there's the literature on the Beats is just, it's endless and it keeps expanding. So I can't possibly read it all, and at some point you just got to stop and say, okay, got to get to it. So I'm hoping to do that very soon. I'm going to say what I want to do here in just a very few minutes is say a little bit about my experience with Beats. That won't take long because I don't have much, to be honest. My friend here has much more to say on that matter. And I'm going to say just a very little bit about the scholarly perspective that I've begun to develop on the Beats. And then I'm going to read a few beat poems that I like. That's sort of it. So this is not a big academic presentation, but I hope, at least by introducing a few ideas, it might spark some questions or some further interest. One thing to mention is that only struck me recently is that the Beats were really part of what Tom Brokaw, I guess, famously called the greatest generation. Most of them were born, between the late 19 teens and into the 1930s. Of course, the younger Beats would not have been old enough to go off to World War II, but many of them were, and my father was part of that generation as well. And strangely, my father was pretty much as straight as they come. And he was a journalist, a very smart and interesting person, but beat was not the word you would use for Ed Jackson. Interestingly, however, he worked for United Press International pretty much all through the late 1940s and 1950s. And he was a colleague there, though I never heard him talk about this, but he had to have been, of David Carr, who was one of the original so-called libertine circle that formed in New York with Ginsberg and Burroughs and Kerouac, David Carr, Herbert Humke, and Neil Cassidy coming in on the scene. So you had this interesting juxtaposition at United Press International of these two products of the greatest generation, who are very different in outlook, and it shows you the complexity of generations. In terms of my own experience, Allen Ginsberg, I was in the presence of 3 different times. I heard him give a wonderful reading at the University of Wisconsin in the, late 1970s, perhaps, early 80s, at the time when he had just published Plutonian Ode, one of his great works. But my first encounter with Ginsberg was in 1968 in Chicago at the Democratic National Convention. My father was working for Time magazine at that point, and through pure nepotism, I was given a job as a messenger at both political conventions that summer. I was basically right out of high school, so I was 18. I was staying in this hotel just north of the Loop in Chicago. Don't know that it's a hotel anymore. And I was on a high floor. And one day, early in the proceedings, I got onto the elevator on my floor, and like on the next floor, the door opens and in walk Allen Ginsberg and Jean Genet. And I knew who these people were. The great beat poet, the great French absurdist dramatist. And they proceeded then, as the elevator went from floor to floor to floor down, it was just the 3 of us, they made out the whole way. So this was not only my first exposure to a beat poet, it was, to be honest, my first exposure in person to anything resembling homosexuality. And the second notable encounter with Ginsberg came in 1975 after my wife, were we married? No, we weren't married yet, but anyway, we had gone to Nepal, we'd gotten into Buddhism, we'd come back, we were hanging out in the New York area before moving to Madison, where I went into a Buddhist studies program, and there was a place down in the village, in the, I guess it's the West Village, McDougal Street, that this guy, Phil Hemley, I've forgotten his exact name, but he would host visiting lamas all the time. So we spent quite a bit of time there. Everybody came through New York at some point. And so when we signed up, sort of sight unseen for a small group interview with the previous Kalu Rinpoche. Any of you who had the chance to meet him you were extraordinarily fortunate, or if you've seen his image, you know the kind of ascetic look that he had. And so we got there, we went into the interview, it was like 5 people. It was my wife and I, or still girlfriend and I, and Allen Ginsberg, Peter Orlovsky, and W.S. Merwin.
Whoa.
And Merwin actually, of any of those, was my poetic hero at the time. When I traveled overland to India, I took the Yi Jing and 2 books of Merwin's poetry. So anyway, so I remember nothing, unfortunately, of what Kalu Rinpoche had to say. I was like, anyway, that was that. Gary Snyder is the only other sort of beat that I ever had an occasion to encounter, and not in quite as striking a way. I mean, I went to a couple of readings, one in St. Mark's in the Bowery in the 70s, and then he came by Northfield, Minnesota when he published Mountains and Rivers Without End, and I, got like 6 copies signed for all my friends and had a conversation with him, invited him to my Mahayana Buddhism class for the next day, and said, no, I gotta leave in the morning. It's nice of him to even respond that nicely, but when I was at Wesleyan, actually, we were big, my suite mates and I were all big fans of Gary Snyder, and we proposed to Wesleyan University that for the class of 1972, our commencement speaker be Gary Snyder. Well, you can imagine. Even Wesleyan was a pretty radical place, to be honest, but no, they did not go for that. We had some long forgotten historian whose kid had gone there, and that was about the way that ended. Anyway, so so switching from the personal to a little more scholarly thing. I'm going to make just some very, very quick points here, because we can pick up on other things later. But one important thing to recognize about the spread of Buddhism as it happened all over the world over the course of pretty much 2,500 years, still happening, of course, is that Buddhism typically, this is certainly true in the Asian context, but I think it can be said in the Western context as well, it spread primarily through conversion of cultural and political elites, right? Buddhism was not a religion of the sword, and we could get into complicated stuff about how religions of the sword, and I know what you're all thinking, are not really religions of the sword as much as is often imagined, but we'll just keep it to Buddhism for the moment. And so, in a place like China, for instance, the intellectuals, the people around the court were the ones who first picked up on Buddhism, and it kind of goes from there. And when we think about the modern era, there's many things about modernity that are perhaps different from the way religion spread in pre-modern eras, but we don't have to worry about that particularly. Just a couple of quick points to make about the spread of Buddhism in the U.S., though, and again, slightly more broadly, North America. That is that most people who study modern Buddhism, especially modern North American Buddhism, are very careful to distinguish between what we might call heritage Buddhists and convert Buddhists, right? I mean, we're talking about the beats, and these are not, for the most part, there are interesting exceptions, but for the most part, these were not people who came from traditionally Buddhist cultures. They were converts. But of course, we all know that Chinese, Japanese, then eventually Koreans, Vietnamese, Thais, Tibetans, all have at various points come to America and introduced their own cultures and their own ways of practicing Buddhism. These two styles of Buddhism are often seen to be kind of disparate and almost at odds with each other, but they actually together feed what is a very rich mix in what we call American Buddhism. I'm not gonna take time to sort of, you all kind of know that, 19th century transcendentalists were kind of interested in Buddhism, Emerson, Thoreau, Whitman, those sort of folks, that theosophy was a popular movement in the late 19th century and claimed to be Buddhist, although they usually dropped one of the D's from Buddhist to distinguish that they were somehow Buddhists of a higher order. There was the famous World Parliament of Religions in Chicago in 1892, 1893, at which they actually invited people from Buddhist countries, Anagarika Dharmapala from Sri Lanka, and Soyen Shaku from Japan, whose translator was D.T. Suzuki, who of course himself would become incredibly influential in the development of Buddhism, slowly, but the development of Buddhism in the first part of the 20th century, along with the works of people like W.Y. Evans Wentz, who edited and brought to the public's attention books like the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the Tibet's great yogi Milarepa, and so forth. There was among intellectuals in the West, a certain fascination with all this. I remember my fourth grade teacher in the 1950s was just totally fascinated by Tibet. You don't know where that comes from exactly, but it was something that was kind of in the culture. Let's see, how am I doing?
Doing great.
Okay, well, that's kind of good to say. Maybe I'll just leave it there. Anyway,
like 5-10 minutes.
yeah, no, I think I can make sure to read a few poems anyway. So
Yeah, do 10. Take 10.
yeah, well, sure. Thank you. Anyway, so it's within this larger frame then that when we come to the 1940s, especially the post-World War II era, and we have all these changes going on in American culture, right? I mean, you have the New York scene in all its various guises with abstract expressionists and experimental music going on, and the poetic and literary scene that people like Kerouac and Ginsberg and Cassidy and others began to sort of home in on. And we can leave aside, I think, for the moment, questions of what counts as a beat. Who's a beat, who isn't a beat? It's a term that a lot of people have kind of resisted having applied to them. I think Gary Snyder's been particularly kind of wary of this, but that's probably because, of course, beat became in most people's minds beatnik. And it's like Maynard G. Krebs, what, beat work? The kind of these images of the hipster, right? That became cliches in American culture and actually, totally belied how serious and interesting the originators of all this were. I will mention very quickly that the word beat itself, which nobody can exactly say who came up with it first. A lot of people say Herbert Huncke probably did, but Kerouac seems to have been the one who publicized it. And then John Cleland Holmes wrote this big piece in Life magazine, "This is the beat generation," so it was there. But it can mean a number of different things, and that's one of those nice ambiguities of the term, right? I think Huncke probably had the sense of, like, man, I'm beat down. He hung out in Times Square a lot, and if you hung out in Times Square in that era, you were definitely beat. But it also had this sense for Kerouac of beatitude, right? Spiritual beatitude. But it also beat in the sense that jazz, especially bebop jazz, was a great influence on the beats. And so that kind of beat in terms of a kind of rhythm of, both art and life was something of interest too. I think perhaps I'll just cut to what to me is kind of in some ways the most interesting question about the early folks in New York, who then eventually they made their way to San Francisco where things were already happening, and then eventually it became a worldwide phenomenon. But most people will say New York was the original central place for it, and they, when Ginsberg and Kerouac and people like that went out to the West Coast in the early to mid 1950s, they kind of cross-pollinated with the whole San Francisco Renaissance scene that was happening out there. So with people like Snyder and Whalen and Kenneth Rexroth was the sort of paterfamilias of the whole scene. And anyway, all this wonderful kind of cross-hatching that happened. But the question of why Buddhism would interest these people, right? I mean, we kind of take it for granted, but it's an interesting question. And I mean, I think several things we could say. A, it's non-Western, and there was the early beats, the very earliest beats, were deeply influenced by Spengler's Decline of the West. The notion that Western civilization was really kind of petering out towards some some end. And so looking to the east was, perhaps that's where wisdom and light are to be found. It was certainly philosophically sophisticated, and there were plenty of translations, even though not nearly as many as we had now, plenty of translations available. It also had, of course, a mystical contemplative side. The emphasis on experience of reality was certainly appealing. It was aesthetically very, very rich, right? I mean, in several, I think that Ginsberg first saw like Chinese paintings in the New York, in the collection of the New York Public Library, and he showed them to Kerouac, and this was really their first exposure to some of this. And then, of course, all the poetic traditions and so forth. And there's at least an apparent emphasis in many of these Asian traditions on spontaneity, which of course is something we do tend to associate with the kind of beat ethos. Now, that can be overstated in terms of the way Asian traditions work, but it is something. Couple of quick caveats, just to, having said that about the appeal of Buddhism for so many of these. Not all the beats were interested in Buddhism. I would mention among the prominent ones, and it's not that they didn't consider it at all, but they didn't sort of run with it the way some of the others did. So William Burroughs, I would say, Neil Cassidy, really. I mean, you can disagree with any of these, but this is my sense on reading stuff. Gregory Corso, Amiri Baraka, originally Leroy Jones, Philip Lamantia, who actually had a very interesting kind of Christian turn. Also, Buddhist beats didn't always and only embrace Buddhism. Hinduism was something that was very influential, I think, for Ginsberg before he met Chogyam Trungpa, and Western mysticism and occultism, goddess traditions, Native American traditions. I mean, I could fill in the names of various figures here, but Diane DePrima, who I've been reading a lot of recently, was deeply, deeply learned in Western occult and magical traditions of one sort or another. Gary Snyder has been, a knowledgeable about Native American traditions, perhaps even longer than he has Buddhist traditions and so forth. And just it's worth mentioning as a follow-up to my earlier comment about sort of heritage and convert Buddhists, that there were Asians or Asian Americans who we might classify as beats. Probably the two best known from the 50s and early 60s are Albert Saijo and Nanao Sakaki. But Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche is perhaps, there's a great story about that I won't get into, but I'll tell
Oh,
you.
come on.
No, I can't right now. No, you gotta respect the time, man. There's this line from Howell, right, who I don't know, maybe you know it exactly, who threw alarm clocks out the window in order to transcend time, something like that. I don't have it exactly. I'll just say that there are, but the Buddhists, or sorry, the beats by the usual classification who did get into Buddhism, minor, I mean, I don't know, minor is really the wrong word, but just to mention a few: Lou Welch, Michael McClure, Joanne Kiger, Lenora Campbell, Bob Kaufman, all fascinating work. But I think it's pretty clear that the key figures are basically Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, Gary Snyder, Philip Whalen, and I think Diane DePrima also. And as mentioned, as Ben mentioned, and as I think all you know, Naropa University, Shambhala Publications, all of these have been deeply woven in with the beats for a very long time. The Jack Kerouac School of Disembodied Poetics was founded in the 70s basically by Ginsberg and DePrima and Anne Waldman especially. There may have been others involved too, but those are the ones that come to mind. So I'm just gonna take like 3 more minutes. Time. Gonna read just a few poems that I like. Okay, I won't read all the poems I've got here, but gonna read Jack Kerouac, Mexico City Blues, 113th chorus. And I won't comment, but just take them in. got up and dressed up and went out and got laid, then died and got buried in a coffin in the grave. Man, yet everything is perfect because it is empty, because it is perfect with emptiness, because it's not even happening. Everything is ignorant of its own emptiness. Anger doesn't like to be reminded of fits. You start with a teaching inscrutable of the diamond and end with it. Your goal is your starting place. No race was run, no walk of prophetic toenails across Arabies of hot meaning. You just numbly don't get there. Okay. This is the sort of conclusion of Ginsberg's famous Sunflower Sutra, which any number of Buddhism scholars I know use to talk about Buddha nature in their classes. How many flies, he's addressing the sunflower, this beaten up old sunflower that he and Jack Kerouac are contemplating, down by the railroad tracks in San Francisco. How many flies buzzed around you, innocent of your grime, while you cursed the heavens of the railroad and your flower soul? Poor dead flower, when did you forget you were a flower? When did you look at your skin and decide you were an impotent old locomotive, the ghost of a locomotive, the specter and shade of a once powerful, mad American locomotive? You were never no locomotive, sunflower. You were a sunflower. And you, locomotive, you are a locomotive, forget me not. So I grabbed up the skeleton thick sunflower and stuck it at my side like a scepter, and deliver my sermon to my soul and Jack's soul too, and anyone who will listen. We're not our skin of grime, we're not our dreary, bleak, dusty, imageless locomotive. We're all beautiful golden sunflowers inside. We're blessed by our own seed and golden, hairy, naked accomplishment bodies, growing into mad black formal sunflowers in the sunset, spied on by our eyes under the shadow of the mad locomotive, riverbank sunset, Frisco hilly, tin can, evening sit-down vision. I won't give you the lines from Wichita Vortex Sutra right now, but so this is this one now is from, and I'm going to also cut this a little bit, but this is sort of the last part of Philip Whalen's Sourdough Mountain Lookout, which my wife and I made a pilgrimage to in the 70s. I don't know if I could climb up that high this time, but anyway. So, closing the lookout in the morning, thick ice on the shutters, coyote almost whistling on a nearby bridge. The mountain is there between two lakes. I brought back a piece of its rock, heavy, dark honey color, with a seam of crystal, some of the quartz stained by its matrix, practically indestructible. A shift from opacity to brilliance. The Zenbos say, lightning flash and flint spark, like the mountains where it was made. What we see of the world is the mind's invention. And the mind, though stained by it, becoming rivers, sun, mule dung, flies, can shift instantly, a dirty bird in a square time. Gone, gone, really gone, into the cool. Oh, mama! Like they say, 4 times up, 3 times down. I'm still on the mountain. That, of course, as you probably recognize, is his take on the Heart Sutra mantra. Okay, just Gary Snyder, Paiute Creek. One granite ridge, a tree would be enough, or even a rock, a small creek, a bark shred in a pool, hill beyond hill, folded and twisted, tough trees crammed in thin stone fractures. A huge moon on it all is too much. The mind wanders, a million summers, night air still, and the rocks warm. Sky over endless mountains, all the junk that goes with being human drops away. Hard rock wavers, even the heavy present seems to fail. This bubble of a heart, words and books, like a small creek off a high ledge, gone in the dry air. A clear, attentive mind has no meaning, but that which sees is truly seen. No one loves rock, yet here we are. Night chills, a flick in the moonlight, slips into Jupiter's shadow. Back there, unseen, cold, proud eyes of cougar or coyote watch me rise and go. Okay, last last thing, a word from Diane Prima, Tassajara in the early 1970s. Maybe some of you were there at the time. It was the sound mostly, the wooden hum, the huge antique drum from Japan, streams singing over the stones, the dinner bell, swish of zoris, occasional winds rattling yucca on the hill. It was the sound and the silence, the way Daddy Longlegs moved on the white walls of the baths, a string quartet of black silent legs. It was the fish-shaped bell, the rustle of robes, the metal disc of the gong, the huge bell shaped like a bowl, the song of frogs, occasional car grinding softly to a stop on gravel in the parking lot, the thud of footsteps over the wooden bridge. It was the echo of voices already gone. They hung in the air, Suzuki Roshi watering rocks so they would grow. Trungpa and his young wife talking in the garden, the thump of giant mallets making, as we made mochi in a hollowed out tree to the rhythm of Japanese and American folk songs late on New Year's Eve in the back of a zendo. It was the chanting that rose and fell like waves, crickets among the lanterns that outlined the paths. It was the small silver school bell that clanged you awake in the dark, and the young monk running by as he rang it, and the silvers of sound the small stars made running by as he rang it, as you walked to the morning zendo through tatters of night sky. Okay.
Wow.
Sorry, I've taken way too much of your time.
I got so comfortable, I'm gonna keep sitting. I just wanted to move this out of the way so I could see you. So I wanted to thank Ben for putting this together, and Roger, that was wonderful. I really enjoyed listening to you. So the first thing that I wanted to say was that the beats, I really like the Whitney Museum's timeline for the beats, because they put out a book called Beat Culture. They assembled this great show, and it was basically 1950 to 1965. So I can't be a beat, even though some people will say that. I'm not too broken up about that. They refer to my ilk as post-beat, so now you know. Anyway, so here we go. I decided what I would do as a counterpoint, although I had no idea what Roger would actually read. I would read something from my book about visiting Naropa in '78 and taking refuge with Chogyam Trungpa. And hopefully there are a few laughs along the way. And that's why I picked this. We headed to the Naropa office on 1111 Pearl Street. At this point, as soon as after our arrival, I heard a sound of a Buddhist monk banging his tennis racket like a drum. He was walking on the street with some banner-carrying locals, beating this inscribed prayer drum, skin stretched over a rim, held in one hand, with a mournful dirge-like rhythm. I found out later that they were here to protest the plutonium triggers that were being built at the nearby Rocky Flats plant. This drum beat hung over our stay like the noise of a pile driver I couldn't escape on a bad teenage mescaline trip. It seemed to say, your grasping ambition and desire are useless. As a counterpoint to this, we ran into Mark Fisher, a poet Peter had brought back to San Francisco for a visit. As Richard noted, Fisher in a dirty sleeveless t-shirt and oversized white cotton pants, also dirty and cuffless, ragged, barefoot, but very confident. He recognized me and in a manic Steve Buscemi style began promising the moon to me like a Hollywood agent as to all the fantastic events I was about to participate in. A public reading with my Burroughs movie to be screened, psychedelic mushrooms in the mountains, hints at inner connections with Trungpa and his regent, which would open to private audiences for me. I had just published in City Lights Journal 4 and New Directions 37, both with remarks from Alan, so I thought a lion's welcome would not be unlikely. Virtually none of Fisher's ravings would pan out over the next week. With the soundtrack of that tennis racket Buddha drum pounding, 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 like the telltale heart, the Red Death holding illimitable dominion over all. He took us to Alan's place, who was out of town for a day or two. I arrived to see Gregory Corso vomiting over the balcony of his second-floor apartment across the way. That night, at a Naropa lecture of Tibetan Lama Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, Gregory Corso came with an entourage of Puerto Rican poets, including Miguel Algaron, founder of the New York Poets Cafe. The retinue consisted of visiting playwright Miguel Pinero. They were all clearly not into it. Trungpa was speaking on the paramitas, the perfections cultivated by the Bodhisattva, and when mentioning something about continuous panoramic awareness, Gregory called out, "That's me all over, Chogi!" Trungpa, without missing a beat, replied, "Seeing is believing." Trungpa then asked if there were any questions, and Gregory answered, "Yeah, I got a question, Chogi." But Trungpa answered other people first, and Corso started heckling him, much to the amusement of his pals. Corso finally said, "I'm splitting," and left with the PRs in tow. Then Trungpa said, "This brings me to the next paramita, patience." Which got a big laugh as Gregory and the others exited. Refuge vows are a formal commitment to Buddhism, and here I was in Boulder visiting poet Alan when suddenly it was possible to take refuge from Chogyam Trungpa, who resided there that summer, a totally unexpected situation and quite auspicious. Ginsberg encouraged us to take the refuge vows. Both Richard and I had to meet with a meditation instructor, senior student, who would determine if we were serious enough to take refuge. Alan arranged the appointment. Richard thinks it was Judith Zimmer Brown. Anyway, she asked us how long we'd been meditating, who taught us, what did we understand about taking refuge. She asked us to sit on cushions and examine our posture. She thought my posture was too military. Now that was a first, but still signed off on my aspiration for refuge. Richard was not criticized and also passed. Since our answers were satisfactory and our posture was correct enough, she added us to the list and said we'd each get an individual audience with Trungpa, who'd give us our refuge name. Although it may not sound like it, I had been relatively diligent with Buddhist sitting on and off since Alan taught me in '74. As I have mentioned, Trungpa wore a suit and, let's see, wait, how does this go? Okay. As I have mentioned, Trungpa wore a suit and smoked cigarettes, as well as having a reputation for copious amounts of sake, so much sake that his liver failed 10 years later at the same age when Kerouac died. That being said, though I am now an alcoholic in recovery, I have nothing but admiration, devotion, and faith for the extraordinary Tibetan master. Trungpa's crazy wisdom, his poetry, his Zorba the Greek earthiness, and his articulate teaching, no matter how much alcohol he drank, made him a truly divine madman, a Mahasiddha that has a long precedent in the Tibetan canon of hagiography. We were each to have a brief interview with him for our Dharma name to be determined. Trungpa was rumored to have extensive psychic powers. Alan, of course Trungpa's student, told me to take a poem to him, and I chose this one, which I'm not going to read because it's incoherent. I was proud of the poem and was ushered in to see Trungpa. He sat at a large obsidian block of a desk, flanked by bodyguards, also in suits. Tibetan calligraphy in tiny frames completed a minimalist and Spartan office that suggested a Japanese Yakuza crime lord. With his crew, though not noted, we had seen a second run of the Yakuza at the Strand after we returned to San Francisco. Great movie. Allen Ginsberg told me to give you this, I intoned, and Trungpa grunted, unimpressed. He jotted down my name, poem unread. Alan wanted me to clean up for the refuge vow. That night at the ceremony, I wore the oversized suit of Peter Orlovsky and Alan's flower tie, which I admired in photos of Alan while I was still in high school a good 8 years earlier. In fact, here's a drawing of it, a cover for a modern lit paper I wrote as a senior. You can't see it, but if you look in the book, you'll see it. I received the name Jangchup Nima, Son of Enlightenment, and tears came to my eyes. As I left, this guy came up to me. Your name, Son of Enlightenment? I nodded gravely, slightly irked by this intrusion into my holy and profound moment of having formally become a Buddhist. That's my name too, he said, which was quite unusual in the same ceremony. I was shocked. Richard and I attended a party that night for the new vow takers. Tim Leary, Ginsberg, and Orlovsky were there and had also attended the ceremony. When Ginsey asked Leary what he thought of the ceremony, he answered, "It was very beautiful." Also, Tenzin, the Caucasian Vajrayeon who later died of AIDS, was at the party filling in for Trungpa. Ginsberg encouraged me to talk to him, and he was being guarded, but he was being guarded by his entourage. Everyone got drunk. There we go. And I ran into this guy again. Ah, Son of Enlightenment! When I left the party, the guy's pulling out in a station wagon, waving from the window, "So long, Son of Enlightenment!" Trungpa may not have read my poem, but he had read the young poet. When I returned, Ginsberg said, "Now Trungpa has inoculated you with his virus." In other words, I could run from Buddhism, but I couldn't hide. Alan was right. Leary came back from a meeting with Trungpa, expecting to be recognized as some sort of colleague, it seemed. Instead, he was made to cool his heels in what he described as a dentist's waiting room. And when he finally was allowed to see Trungpa, all the Lama said was, "Stay out of trouble." Seemed good advice to me. Okay, I think that's it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, really different from my Naropa experience. I went to Naropa from 2011 to 2015. We were not getting drunk with our teachers. Unfortunately, we had some pretty cool teachers too. So yeah, we got a little bit of time. Oh yeah, we have 20 minutes. We're doing great. These guys are both selling and signing books afterwards, and you're welcome to hang out. I guess, so in my preparation for meeting with you guys today, I've been doing a little bit of reading, and I think one of the things that's really striking to me, and also looking at the demographics in the room, is how countercultural and how much of a youth movement the rise of Buddhism was in America. What do you think happened to Buddhism being cool? Why was it so cool? And you were saying, with cultural elites.
Dude, it's still cool.
Oh yeah. I would say cool in terms of pop cultural connotation. Ginsberg, right, he was famous. He was a pop culture figure. So what changed? Why did you have this moment? Why are there almost exclusively boomers in this room right now? And what's your analysis of that? I'm kind of curious. That's my first question.
Oh, you're asking us.
Oh, yeah.
You go, man. You
All
go.
right, I'll take a first shot at it. I mean, obviously, I'm guilty as charged, right? I'm exactly who you're talking about. Although actually, I looked out in the room and I thought, well, there are a lot of people here who are younger than I am,
Right?
Which is not hard to do these days, actually. But no, your point still remains a true one, and yet, one of the things that fascinates me is that the beats have continued to, sort of decade after decade, there is this interest. I mean, there's a whole scholarly mill that cranks out dissertations on the beats, and for whatever reason, the Beats are not just a phenomenon of the baby boom generation, I don't think. I mean, their work stands up and will. But more to the point, I mean, my reflection would be more personal here, but I was definitely of the, American society is going to hell because of assassinations and racism in the Vietnam War, and I sure hope I don't get drafted. And all wisdom is to be found in the East. And, Gary Snyder, Kerouac, Ginsberg in his way at that time, they were all pointing the way to this. I mean, I made this remark about Buddhism spreading through cultural elites, and in this case, I would probably qualify my comment slightly and just say, in this case, they were way preparers, as we sometimes say in the Tibetan tradition. They were pioneers, but they were countercultural elites.
Yeah.
But they were definitely in the elite. I mean, not beat literature, abstract expressionist art, bebop, John Cage, all these they had their relations, but it wasn't for everybody. It was out there in many respects. But then, as is so often the case with avant-garde movements, the rest of the world kind of catches up, and then you get the development of the stereotype of the beatnik, but also people begin to see that, these are actually pretty serious literary people. It's not the famous Truman Capote line about on the road, right? It's not writing, it's typing. That's, I think more people are reading Kerouac these days than Truman Capote, with due respect to a fine writer. So I think it was the zeitgeist, right? But I think it's continued, and another point about it is that when somebody like Kerouac went to the San Jose Public Library in early 1954, he was visiting Neil and Carolyn Cassidy, who were living out there, and he took out a Buddhist Bible, right? Dwight Goddard's very interesting compilation of long translations from some early Buddhist, but mostly Mahayana Buddhist literature, including the Lankavatara Sutra, at least not all of it, but a whole lot of it. And this became his vade-mecum for several years. He took it everywhere. Kerouac actually did an extraordinarily deep study of Buddhism. I mean, I've got a paper coming out somewhere that's basically defending. I'm trying to talk about Kerouac's Mexico City blues as American Dohas, but that's an argument for another time. My point here is that there wasn't that much that people had to go on. There was the writings of D.T. Suzuki. There were some of these translations that have been around for a while, and it was only really in the 60s, I would say, that, for instance, Tibetans began coming to America, Vietnamese, folks from actual Buddhist cultures who would interact with these young Americans, non-heritage Buddhists who were interested in it all. So it was just, they helped prepare the way for what became the much more complicated and, one might say, much more finely tuned versions of Buddhism that we see in America now. So of course some people will say, no, American Buddhism is totally out of tune, but that's another argument for another day.
I don't need the
You don't need it.
I think the main thing is, as all of us remember, is in the late 60s there was an international youth movement, which, and the Vietnam War was really a catalyst for a lot of that. And then on top of it, you put a severe dose of LSD into the situation, and everyone's going, what the hell was that? And Alan Watts had a phrase where he said, Tibetan Buddhism is Catholicism on acid. Which was probably the only intelligent thing he had to say about Vajrayana. But, it made people, you looked at those Tonkas after taking LSD and you go like, well, this seems to be related. I don't really think it is, but at the same time, there is a visionary element that they were plugging into. Plus, you have all this political rising. So this was an extraordinary time. I think this is why people have such a nostalgia about it. You know, I meet these young people who they just think the '60s are great. You know, it's funny because in the '80s, you know, in the early '80s when punk rock was fashionable, we despised the hippies. You know, we thought they were idiots. And, you know, and now we have this weird amalgam, you know, with something like Burning Man, where they're hippies and they're also punks and they're also, you know, into piercing and all kinds of stuff, and it all comes together. And the separation doesn't even make sense to these younger people anymore. They don't. What would be so embarrassing about being a hippie? You know, how is it different from being a beat or, you know, beatnik as they call it? You know, in a lot of ways, beatniks looked like, you know, the new wave punk rockers of the '50s. I mean, of the '80s. You know, with short hair and, you know, Ray-Ban glasses and all this. But so when you look at the present, I find, you know, I teach a poetry class online, and I call it Writing Mindfulness, and I sneak in as much beat material as I possibly can, and people seem to like it, and it lets them follow the sort of breadcrumbs that Roger was talking about, like, well, what is this? Oh, this is interesting. Or they've read the Dharma Bums. That seems to be the biggest influence. They've read the Dharma Bums. Everyone says On the Road is, you know, something that really influenced them. I think the Dharma Bums is way more influential.
Especially when it comes to Buddhism.
Oh yeah, exactly, in terms of that. So there's something happening underneath the culture in a lot of ways. And certainly young people who are really investigating, you know, in an autodidactic way, the '60s and what this was about. And of course, there isn't any draft, which is a huge catalyst. You know, and if there was, that would change a lot of things. I think people would just leave, is actually. But at any rate, so there is some hope, but there's now so many things you can do.
Facts.
You know, I just saw, you know, there's a young assistant to my wife, and he said, oh, I'm going up to see my favorite band, Liquid Stranger. And I went like, oh, I haven't heard of Liquid Stranger. I'll go listen to them. And it was like the latest in rave, basically. So all these kids are out of their minds on drugs. And, you know, but, you know, it's different from the Grateful Dead. Nobody's going around like this, you know. They're, you know, waving a little glow stick, you know, and staring at this huge screen, and it was absolutely packed. You know, the music was okay, you know, but he told me that when he got into it, this was really a heavy drug period. So that's the new religion, you know. In a lot of ways, I think Grateful Dead was the religion that was easiest to accept, you know, to access. Mm-hmm. And now this stuff is the easiest stuff, and you know
And for the record, I think Buddhism is cool. I was trying more generally to speak. I think the beats are very cool, and I think Buddhism is very cool. We only have like 10 minutes. Sorry to interrupt.
Oh, yeah.
I have a more like, okay, so you wrote about Saraha.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't read the book.
Right.
I didn't know who Saraha was. I'm not a Buddhist scholar. So was he a poet that then has become something else because of the quality? I guess basically my question is, with this question of what is American Buddhism, you know, what will American Buddhism be? Is there a possibility that Mexico City Blues, 300 years from now, if we don't blow each other up in the next 10 years with nuclear weapons, 300 years from now, is Mexico City Blues going to be a sutra that is read in an American Buddhist temple? Will Kerouac be considered a vanguard bodhisattva? And like, what do you see as the shape of American Buddhism to come? And what do you think the Beat's role is in that?
Another small question.
Yeah, thinking small.
I mean, Kerouac is such an interesting case because a lot of his fellow beats, people like Philip Whalen, sort of like, well, Jack really was an autodidactic Buddhist. He never had a Buddhist teacher. He never learned to meditate. He hurt his leg playing football. He got a football scholarship to Columbia, but then hurt his leg, and that was the end of his football career. And we're all grateful for that. But I think there's Kerouac will probably not be seen as an absolutely exemplary Buddhist. He was very sincere, and he wrote an incredible amount about it. And I think he had insights, particularly if you read in and around some of the Dharma, this huge posthumous collection of writings that he did on Buddhism. Basically, it was to try to convert Allen Ginsberg to Buddhism. He wrote it from like 1954 to 1956, and it came out 20 years after Kerouac died, probably. I mean, there's some amazing insights. Whether he was able to get the two truths to correspond is an open question. That's a question you could ask about the particular Mexico City blues chorus I read. But back to your point of, I mean, it's an interesting question. I think that they will be seen, somebody like Gary Snyder, who spent most of 2 decades mostly in Buddhist temples in Kyoto, really he knows his stuff. And Philip Whalen became a Zen abbot towards the end of his life. In one way or another, many of them began studying very seriously. Ginsberg, once he met Trungpa, much of his poetry after about 1970 really is Buddhist themed. Diane de Prima, again, had so many different things going on, but she was first a student of Zen with Shunryu Suzuki, and then Katagiri Roshi a little bit in Minneapolis. She's got a wonderful poem about visiting Katagiri Roshi in Minneapolis. But then Chogyam Trungpa, and then after Chogyam Trungpa died, Tarchin Rinpoche. So, they got to know these traditions well. So broadly speaking, I think it's not just that when we talk about Chinese Buddhism, which is a very interesting comparison point, we often talk about how, well, at the beginning, they had to translate everything into the way Chinese were already thinking. So they would use Taoist terminology for Buddhist terms. I mean, in fact, the word Dharma was first translated into Chinese as Tao. Well, yeah, yes, no. And it's a little bit like that, I think, with the beats. They were among the first to really begin to take this with increasing seriousness, and some of them got certain elements of it, some of them didn't. But again, they were way pavers, as I said. And Saraha, and if I'd had more time, I would have read a verse or two from Saraha. And if I'm going to sell any books, I should give you one. Huh? Do I have time to read one
Yes,
quick
please.
thing? Yeah, sorry. Where is it? Oh, here we go. Back to front stuff here. I was going to read some Han Shan and some haiku, but anyway, I'll just give you some Saraha. So this is actually from the book, and the book is translated from Tibetan, although some of Saraha's verses are found in the original Indic language of Apabhramsha, where they're rhyming couplets. That's what a doha is. That's what the word means, actually, a couplet. Anyway, this is just a few, like 5 verses from Saraha to give you a feel, and for why I saw Saraha as sort of a forerunner of the beats, even though he doesn't come up with the beats quite as much as Zen poets did or Chinese poets, but nevertheless, he's definitely, as noted, kind of in this so-called crazy wisdom lineage. Hey, you, whatever is said is wrong and a lie, cast it off. Whatever you're fixated on, let it go. When you're relaxed, everything is that, for no one knows anything other than that. Study is that. Apprehension and meditation are that. Treatises explaining the essence are also that. But there is no view that indicates that. It depends solely on the Guru's word. If the Guru's sayings have entered your heart, it's like seeing treasure in the palm of your hand. The primordial nature is unseen by fools. Fools, says Saraha, are deceived by error. Without contemplation, without renunciation, staying at home with your wives, if you're not freed from bondage by enjoying sense objects, then say, I, Saraha, you don't know thatness. If it's manifest, what's contemplation do? If it's hidden, you only encounter darkness. Thatness, the connate nature, is neither a thing nor a non-thing. Thus does Saraha ever loudly lament.
Well, yeah, I guess we have time for a question. If anyone's got a great question, or we can go to.
We don't have a hard ending.
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
that's
no,
true.
so-
You guys, let's do some questions then.
You mentioned some women, I think, who were
Yes.
connected with. Would you repeat who you?
The ones that I
Subtly
mentioned.
and clearly.
Yes, sorry. The ones that I mentioned were Diane de Prima, in my mind, most prominently. I think she's the greatest poet of maybe of any of them, honestly. I'm on a big kick anyway. And Lenore Candle, who was one of the along with Ginsberg, I don't know that Ginsberg was ever actually arrested. Ferlinghetti got in trouble for publishing Howl, and there was this famous trial. Lenore Candle also wrote, like, frankly erotic poetry. One of her most famous kind of groups of poems is the general title is To Fuck with Love. And she would recite this at poetry readings. Anyway, trouble ensued, and as usual, of course, they won. But she also was drawn to Buddhism in various ways, and a number of her works touch on Buddhism. Joanne Kiger, who is unfortunately probably best known as one of Gary Snyder's previous wives, but a very fine poet in her own right, but spent a lot of when Gary was in Japan, she was living with him there. Her Japanese journals are so interesting to read. I mean, the one line that I keep remembering from them is, well, Gary thinks he's a genius, and he probably is, but, you know, that's what I'm like, try living with this guy. And Gary just turned 95 a few days ago, so
Wow.
he's the last living, I would say the last living beat in many respects. So those three are the best known, from my standpoint, at least in terms of their interest in and some writing about Buddhism. One of the other things that's sometimes noted is that people will often see the Beats as this kind of white heterosexual male movement, and I think the value in bringing to the forefront people like Lenore Candle and Diane de Prima and Joanne Kiger and others. Similarly, somebody like Bob Kaufman, very interesting figure, who was black, I think originally from New Orleans, but ended up in the Bay Area. Amiri Baraka, who originally was Leroy Jones, both blacks, and Ted Jones, right? There were a number of blacks who were drawn to the movement. So, you know, the kind of, quite apart from the beatnik stereotype, the stereotype of the beat literary movement as this mostly almost macho kind of, you know, fraternity of bad boys, it's much more complicated than that. David?
Just a footnote to that is that Diane wrote a memoir of what it was like to be a woman in that
Yes.
interview.
It's an incredible book. It's called Recollections of My Life as a Woman, and she's a brilliant writer, and it gives you such a feel for. She stops it in the 60s, and she says, "Oh, I'll do a second volume about when I moved to the West Coast." She never did, but it's an extraordinary look at the New York downtown art and literary scene, especially in the 1950s. A great book. Yeah. Do you want to add anything to that, or?
Questions for each other?
Well, only that I think you should include Ann Waldman.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting one. Right.
She, you know, my own cutting off at 1965, and had not quite published then, but she did very soon after that.
Yeah.
She's often affiliated with the Beats and is called Beat, and she's quite wonderful and very, very Buddhist.
Can you
Yeah.
say her name again?
Anne Waldman.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting case. I'm certainly very much aware of her. I used to teach. She's got this incredible book called, let's see, the universe in the simile of a bubble or something like that. I don't have it exactly right, but it's this long poem that's about the Buddhist stupa at Borobudur, and it's got instructions for ringing gongs and walking in particular ways. Quite extraordinary, and because she was so instrumental in the early years of Naropa Institute, now Naropa University, she's definitely put together. She was born approximately 10 years after even the youngest of the people typically called meet. So I'm in my book, it's like, okay, where do I put her? You know, it's like, you definitely talk about her, and she's done so much to help preserve beat culture at Naropa. Naropa is sort of one of the great, has one of the great collections of beat materials for beat studies, and it's actually all online. And since there isn't much left of a physical plant at Naropa, it's a good thing it's online. Anyway, yeah, no, a very good point about Anne Waldman. Yeah.
By the way, there's a great documentary, I think you can see it on YouTube now, called Fried Shoes, Cooked Diamonds. And it covers this same period that I read about at Naropa. And it is really a good documentary, really good.
There's also, along those lines, I can never remember the guy's name, but there's a book, and I don't remember who published it either, but it was called When I Was Cool.
Oh, that.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. A guy who also was at Naropa in the sort of mid to late 70s, and, you know, it's kind of a tell-all about, you know, what Corso did and what De Prima did and what Trumpa did and so forth. No, okay. I thought it was quite funny, but.
Well, he's entertaining. He writes for Vanity Fair, so you can imagine it's very glib and fun, breezy.
I missed who you're talking about.
We don't, because none of us can remember his
Sam
name.
Kashner.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Right, it's called When I Was
Definitely a
Cool.
Sam. Yeah.
Anyway.
Don't read it. Buddhism in the Beats Passages Bookshop gives it a 2. You gave it a good review, bad review.
Well, I wouldn't give
I
it a
haven't read
5,
it, so
but-
maybe 3 out of 5 stars. So.
Okay.
No, any more questions? All right, make sure you get on our Portland Shambhala email list so we can tell you about other cool stuff. And I think we did it. Let's have a round of applause.